A war that burned down the White House, ended in a battle fought after peace was already declared, and was almost entirely forgotten by the country that started it. The War of 1812 is one of history's strangest conflicts, full of bizarre decisions, accidental heroes, and moments so ridiculous they sound completely made up. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Fact 1. The War of 1812 did not actually begin in 1812. While the United States formally declared war on Great Britain on June 18, 1812, the conflict dragged on until February 1815, when the Senate ratified the peace treaty. That makes the total duration roughly 2.5 years, spanning parts of 3 separate calendar years, yet history has fixed the name, the War of 1812, permanently on the whole affair, which has to be one of the most misleading titles in military history. It would be as though you started a long argument in January, were still arguing in March of the following year, and someone wrote it all down as the argument of January. The name captures only the opening chapter of a long, confused, and frequently embarrassing story. By the same naming logic, World War I should be called the War of 1914, which would at least place the starting point correctly, though the war ended in 1918, so that would also be technically incomplete. Fact 2. The United States declared war on Britain before Britain even knew there was a serious problem that needed solving. The British government had already decided to repeal the Orders in Council, which were the trade restrictions that American merchants had been furious about for years. But transatlantic communication in 1812 moved at the speed of a sailing ship, which meant weeks of ocean crossing between news and response. By the time any word of Britain's concession could possibly reach Washington, the war declaration had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. The result was that thousands of men would eventually die, cities would be burned, and enormous treasure would be spent, all over a dispute that had technically already been resolved on the British side before the first shot was fired in genuine anger. It is a fairly remarkable demonstration of how catastrophically the absence of real-time communication can shape historical events. Fact 3. The American declaration of war passed by the narrowest margin of any formal war declaration in United States history. The House of Representatives voted 79 in favor and 49 against, which is not exactly a ringing national consensus on the wisdom of going to war. The Senate vote was even closer, coming in at 19 for and 13 against. A significant and vocal portion of American politicians thought the whole idea was misguided, premature, economically ruinous, or some combination of all three. The opposition was concentrated heavily in New England and the northeastern states, where the merchant class understood with cold clarity that a war with Britain would destroy the carrying trade that had made them wealthy. Southern and Western members of Congress, the so-called war hawks, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, pushed hardest for the war, partly out of genuine grievance over impressment and trade restrictions, and partly out of enthusiasm for the territorial expansion they expected to follow a Canadian conquest. Their concerns about the war's wisdom, it turned out, were remarkably well-founded, as the next 2 years would produce a string of military embarrassments, a burning capital, a commerce-destroying naval blockade, and a peace treaty that restored the pre-war status quo without addressing any of the original grievances that had supposedly made the war necessary in the first place. Fact 4. One of the central causes of the war was the British practice of impressment, in which Royal Navy officers would board American merchant ships on the high seas and forcibly recruit sailors into the Royal Navy. The British position was that many of these sailors were British citizens who had deserted His Majesty's service and were hiding behind fraudulent American papers. The American position was that many of these men were genuine American citizens being kidnapped into foreign military service, having their rights violated, and being dragged across the ocean to serve on warships in a war that was not their country's. Both sides had genuine points. British deserters did make up a portion of American merchant crews, since life as an American merchant sailor was considerably pleasanter than service aboard a Royal Navy warship. But British press gangs also undeniably seized genuine American citizens. The argument was essentially impossible to resolve by diplomacy because both sides were simultaneously right and wrong, which is one of the more reliable recipes for eventual violence. Fact 5. Canada was one of the primary targets of the American invasion plan, and the political class in Washington was shockingly overconfident about how simple the conquest would be. Thomas Jefferson, who was watching events from retirement at Monticello, famously declared that the acquisition of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. The statement has aged very poorly. Jefferson imagined that the Canadian population, a significant portion of whom were recent American immigrants or loyalists still nursing grievances about the Revolution, would rise up and welcome the American armies as liberators. What he did not adequately weigh was that recent immigrants who had chosen to stay in Canada under British governance had often done so precisely because they preferred British governance, or at least preferred not to fight about it, and that the Loyalists in particular had fled the United States because they did not want to live in a republic. The reality on the ground was that Canadian civilians were considerably more interested in defending their homes than in surrendering them to armies that were destroying farms and towns in their advance. The invasions of Canada were chaotic, poorly coordinated, repeatedly repulsed, and largely unsuccessful from beginning to end. Canada remained firmly British throughout the entire conflict, and, it is worth mentioning, has remained so ever afterward, a fact that Jefferson did not live to fully appreciate since he died in 1826, with his prediction permanently and definitively unfulfilled. Fact 6. The man appointed as Governor General of British North America at the start of the war was Sir George Prevost, and his appointment would prove to be one of the more consequential bad decisions of the conflict. Prevost was by training and temperament a diplomat rather than a military commander, and he approached the defense of Canada with a caution that frequently crossed the line into paralysis. He consistently refused to approve offensive operations that his field commanders argued could dramatically change the course of the war, countermanded orders when subordinates showed initiative, and repeatedly prioritized avoiding defeat over seeking victory. His commanders, who included some genuinely talented soldiers, found him maddening. After the war ended, Prevost was called to Britain to face a court-martial for his handling of the Battle of Plattsburgh, in which he had ordered a retreat that his subordinates considered premature and unnecessary. He died in January 1816 before the court-martial could be completed, which at least spared him the formal verdict, though history has not been particularly kind to his reputation. Fact 7. The British commander in Upper Canada at the start of the war was Major General Isaac Brock, and he was essentially the opposite of his superior Prevost in every meaningful way. Where Prevost was cautious, Brock was bold. Where Prevost sought to minimize risk, Brock accepted it eagerly. He had spent years on a posting he found frustratingly distant from the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, where real glory and promotion were to be had, and when war finally came to his doorstep, he embraced it with tremendous energy. Brock understood that the defense of Canada depended heavily on maintaining the confidence of Indigenous allies and the loyalty of a civilian population that was not entirely sure it wanted to fight American neighbors. He built relationships, made promises, and delivered results quickly enough to keep everyone on side. He is remembered today as one of the great heroes of Canadian history, which is slightly ironic since he was British-born had no personal connection to Canada before his posting, and his primary motivation was holding the colony together until the Napoleonic Wars were resolved and proper reinforcements could arrive. Fact 8. Isaac Brock executed one of the great psychological bluffs in military history at the Siege of Detroit in August 1812. The American General William Hull commanded a force of about 2,000 men defending the city, which should have been more than sufficient to hold out against the forces Brock had available. But Brock used every trick at his disposal to make his opponent believe the opposite. He marched his men in large visible circles to make his numbers appear larger. He dressed Indigenous warriors in red coats borrowed from regular soldiers, making them appear to be British regulars. He sent runners carrying messages in clear text, knowing they would be intercepted, containing false estimates of his force's size. Then he sent Hull a letter warning that once fighting began, he would be unable to control the Indigenous warriors under his command, implying a massacre of the civilian population if Hull did not surrender peacefully. Hull, who was an elderly man whose health was reportedly poor and whose nerves had not been improved by the campaign so far, capitulated without firing a meaningful shot. He surrendered the garrison, the town, the artillery, and an American warship in the harbor. The British captured an entire army at essentially zero cost, which remains one of the more spectacular confidence tricks in the history of warfare. Fact 9. William Hull was court-martialed for his surrender at Detroit and was actually sentenced to be shot. The sentence was upheld on the charge of cowardice and neglect of duty, and for a brief period, Hull faced a genuinely terminal outcome as a result of his military failures. President James Madison commuted the death sentence, sparing Hull on account of his Revolutionary War service, during which he had actually conducted himself with considerable bravery. Hull spent much of the rest of his life attempting to vindicate himself, writing pamphlets and memoirs in which he argued that his surrender had been the result of impossible circumstances, inadequate support from Washington, and the genuine impossibility of his military position. Historians have given his arguments a somewhat mixed reception. Most acknowledge that he was badly let down by the government that sent him into the field, but few have been willing to fully excuse the manner of his surrender. Fact 10. The Indigenous leader, Tecumseh, stands as one of the genuinely remarkable figures of the entire conflict, a man whose military and political abilities exceeded those of most of the professional officers on either side of the war. Tecumseh had spent the better part of 2 decades building a confederation of indigenous nations across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions, based on the principle that individual tribes could not resist American expansion alone, but that a united indigenous front might. The War of 1812 seemed to offer a genuine opportunity to achieve what diplomacy had not managed, with British military backing providing the force that indigenous resistance alone could not sustain. Tecumseh held the rank of brigadier general in the British forces, which was a formal recognition of his importance to their military operations. He was known among British officers for his battlefield competence, his personal courage, and his insistence on treating prisoners humanely. He reportedly saved British officers from being harmed by his own warriors on at least one occasion, and he publicly condemned the killing of prisoners in terms that embarrassed some of the British regulars who had been willing to allow it. Fact 11. Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813, and his death immediately became one of the most contested events of the entire war. Multiple American soldiers came forward to claim the honor of having personally killed the famous leader, and their competing claims became part of the political culture of the following years. The Kentucky militiaman Richard Mentor Johnson built an entire political career on his claim to have shot Tecumseh personally, using the slogan, Rumpsy Dumpsy, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh in his various campaigns for office. The rhyme was undignified, but apparently effective. Johnson eventually served as Vice President of the United States under Martin Van Buren. Whether he actually killed Tecumseh is genuinely unknown. Several other men made equally compelling or equally dubious claims, and the body on the battlefield was so badly treated in the immediate aftermath that identifying it with certainty became impossible. Fact 12. After Tecumseh's death at the Thames, some American soldiers reportedly skinned portions of his body to use as razor strops and souvenirs, cutting strips of flesh from the corpse of the fallen leader. This particular detail is disturbing enough that some historians have questioned whether it actually occurred, noting that stories of atrocities committed against enemy dead were sometimes invented or exaggerated for propaganda purposes. However, the accounts come from multiple independent witnesses, including some Americans who were appalled by what they saw, and the general outline of the story has been accepted by most serious historians of the period. The act was condemned even at the time by many American officers and citizens who considered it barbaric, which suggests that contemporary norms, even the fairly flexible norms of frontier warfare, considered this behavior to be outside acceptable limits. Fact 13. The British held an enormous structural advantage in the early stages of the war that often goes unacknowledged in American popular histories of the conflict, and that advantage was experience. Britain had been fighting the Napoleonic Wars continuously since 1803, meaning that the veterans who eventually arrived in Canada had faced some of the finest armies in Europe on the battlefields of Spain and Portugal. These were professional soldiers who had lived and fought under campaign conditions for years. Against them, the American regular army of 1812 was small, chronically underfunded, poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and led by a senior officer corps consisting largely of elderly Revolutionary War veterans who had not commanded troops in a serious engagement in 30 years, and younger officers who had never commanded anything at all beyond small frontier garrisons. The wonder is not that American armies performed poorly in the early stages of the war, but that they performed as well as they occasionally did. Fact 14. The American Navy, despite being dwarfed by the Royal Navy in almost every measurable category, performed remarkably well in individual ship-to-ship engagements during the opening months of the war. American frigates won a series of surprising victories against British warships in single combat engagements on the open ocean, victories that were deeply humiliating for the nation that considered itself the absolute master of the seas. The British public and press were genuinely shocked, and the government initially tried to downplay or suppress reports of the defeats. The size difference between the two navies was staggering. Britain maintained hundreds of warships in commission, while the entire American Navy could muster only a handful of frigates and smaller vessels. What the Americans had built, however, were frigates that were heavier, more powerfully armed, and more robustly constructed than their British counterparts, and they were manned by experienced, highly motivated crews who had spent years sailing merchant ships and understood the sea as intimately as any sailor afloat. The victories gave Americans something to celebrate and boast about at a time when the news from the land frontier was almost uniformly dismal, which made them politically important out of proportion to their purely military significance. They could not break the blockade, could not protect American commerce, and could not change the strategic balance at sea. But they demonstrated with great clarity that American sailors were the equal of British ones, which was a point of pride that resonated deeply in a young nation still trying to establish its credentials on the world stage. Fact 15. The USS Constitution earned its famous nickname Old Ironsides during its battle with HMS Guerriere in August 1812, one of the most celebrated single-ship actions in American naval history. During the engagement, which lasted roughly 30 minutes of intense fighting at close range, British cannonballs were observed bouncing off the Constitution's hull, and a sailor in the rigging supposedly shouted that her sides were made of iron. The hull was not actually iron at all. It was made of extremely dense live oak timber from Georgia, a wood so hard and so closely grained that in favorable conditions cannonballs could be deflected rather than penetrating. The Constitution destroyed the Guerriere so completely that her captain could not take the British ship as a prize and was forced to burn the hulk at sea. The Constitution still exists today, making her the oldest commissioned warship still afloat in the world. She is maintained by the United States Navy and berthed in Boston Harbor, where visitors can walk her decks and stand in the same spaces where those cannonballs bounced harmlessly off her sides. Fact 16. The Royal Navy's institutional response to the string of early frigate defeats was a mixture of genuine shock and bureaucratic denial. The First Lord of the Admiralty, John Wilson Croker, initially attempted to prevent the defeats from being widely publicized, which proved impossible given the number of witnesses and the speed with which news spread through maritime circles. When suppression failed, he issued a directive, essentially telling British frigates to avoid one-on-one engagements with the heavy American frigates unless circumstances were strongly favorable. This was a remarkable tacit admission from an institution that considered itself unbeatable at sea. The Royal Navy was not accustomed to acknowledging that another navy had ships that could beat theirs in a fair fight, and the policy of avoiding even contests was deeply unpopular with British naval officers who found it demeaning. Fact 17. The war produced Andrew Jackson as a national military hero, which turned out to be one of the most consequential things it did in terms of long-term American history. Jackson was a man of limited formal military training, but extraordinary force of will, physical toughness, and an ability to extract more effort from frontier militiamen than professional officers could typically manage. His approach to military command was unconventional in many ways. He was intensely personal in his relationship with his troops, eating the same food and sleeping in the same conditions, but he was also ferociously authoritarian about discipline and did not hesitate to order executions for offenses that other commanders might have treated leniently. He ordered the execution of soldiers for desertion and mutiny at a time when many commanders were reluctant to impose capital punishment for fear of further undermining already fragile troop morale. His willingness to apply extreme measures reflected a view that the survival of his army and the success of his mission outweighed the lives of individuals who threatened either. His nickname, Old Hickory, a reference to the hardness and inflexibility of hickory wood, captured something real about his character. Hickory is the toughest wood in the North American forest, hard enough to make axe handles and hammerheads, resilient enough to bend before it breaks, and virtually impossible to destroy once it decides to hold. Jackson was exactly that kind of commander, and his troops loved him for it, even when they feared him, which is one of the more unusual combinations a military leader can inspire. Fact 18. By the time Andrew Jackson commanded forces in the War of 1812, his body had already been serving as an involuntary storage facility for metal for some years. He had a bullet lodged in his chest from a duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806, a wound that had come within an inch of his heart and that had never been removed. He had a second bullet lodged near his left shoulder from a brawl with Thomas Hart Benton and his brother in 1813, a wound that was so serious that some army surgeons initially thought the arm might need to be amputated. He had a saber scar across his face from the Revolutionary War, received when, as a teenage prisoner of the British, he had refused to clean an officer's boots and been struck across the cheek in response. Jackson subsequently spent his entire life hating the British with a focused personal intensity that the War of 1812 gave him a perfect opportunity to express. Fact 19. The burning of Washington in August 1814 is the most famous single event of the entire war, and while most people know the broad outline of the story, the details are considerably stranger than the general narrative suggests. The British force that captured and burned the American capital was not large. It consisted of roughly 4,000 soldiers, mostly veterans of the Peninsular War in Spain, who marched from the Chesapeake Bay landing area to the capital and back in the space of about a week. They faced essentially no opposition after the disorganized American militia collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg. The ease of the operation was a remarkable indictment of American military preparedness, especially given that the British Navy had been raiding the Chesapeake region for months, and the possibility of an attack on Washington had been obvious to anyone paying attention. Fact 20. The portrait of George Washington that Dolly Madison saved during the burning of Washington has become one of the most enduring images of the war, and the story has grown somewhat in the telling. Contemporary accounts, including Dolly Madison's own letter written that day, indicate that she remained in the White House long after most of the staff had fled, waiting for news from the front that never arrived in reassuring form. When it became clear that the British were coming and no American forces were going to stop them, she gave orders for the large portrait of Washington in the dining room to be saved. The portrait was screwed to the wall and could not be removed quickly, so servants broke the frame and extracted the canvas. Dolly appears to have departed before the portrait was actually taken down. The enslaved workers in the household, whose names history has largely not preserved, did the physical labor of saving the painting. The portrait, which actually dates from 1797 and is one of Gilbert Stuart's famous Lansdowne portraits, still hangs in the White House today. Fact 21. When British forces entered the White House after the Americans had fled, they found a dinner table set and fully prepared, with food warming in the kitchen and wine cooling in a side room. President Madison had apparently planned to return to the executive mansion to dine after what he hoped would be a successful American defense at Bladensburg. The British officers, in what seems like the most perfectly ironic moment of the entire war, sat down at the table of the President of the United States and ate his dinner. They drank his wine. Several officers reportedly took souvenirs from the house, and then they set the building on fire and walked away. The British commander, Admiral Cockburn, allegedly took a cushion from Dolly Madison's sitting room as a personal memento. Multiple British accounts confirm the broad outlines of this episode, which has the quality of dark comedy that the best historical anecdotes always carry. Fact 22. The weather may have saved what remained of Washington from complete destruction. While the British were systematically burning government buildings, a powerful storm swept through the city with enough force to extinguish many of the fires that had already been set and to prevent others from spreading as far as they might otherwise have reached. Some accounts describe the storm as a tornado, others as a severe thunderstorm with exceptionally strong winds. Whatever its precise meteorological character, the storm killed at least 2 British soldiers, overturned artillery pieces, and caused the kind of disruption that made continued operations in the city impractical. General Robert Ross, who commanded the land forces, interpreted the storm as a signal that it was time to withdraw, and the British departed the next day. Whether the storm was divine intervention, lucky meteorology, or simply the climate of the mid-Atlantic in August expressing itself vigorously, it probably prevented additional destruction. Fact 23. The United States Patent Office was spared from the British burning of Washington because of a remarkable act of individual persuasion. The Superintendent of Patents, William Thornton, personally confronted the British officers who were preparing to set fire to the building and argued with considerable eloquence that destroying the records of human scientific and mechanical invention would be an act of barbarism equivalent to burning the Library of Alexandria. He reportedly pointed out that the patents belonged to citizens of many nations, not just to the American government, and that their destruction would be an affront to the progress of civilization rather than a blow against the American military establishment. The British officer in charge found this argument sufficiently persuasive to spare the building. The irony is that Thornton had also been the architect who designed the United States Capitol building, which the British burned without similar philosophical hesitation. Fact 24. The burning of Washington was framed by the British commander, Admiral Cockburn, as deliberate retaliation for American actions in Canada, specifically the burning of the Parliament buildings at York, which is now Toronto, during an American raid in April 1813. American forces had attacked the capital of Upper Canada, burned the Parliament building and various government structures, and looted civilian property. The British explicitly cited York when justifying their actions in Washington, creating one of history's more symmetrical cycles of retaliatory destruction. Neither act of Capitol burning accomplished anything of genuine strategic value. Both left civilian populations traumatized and government operations disrupted. Both provided propaganda material for the other side. The entire exchange was essentially an escalating argument in which both parties were simultaneously wrong. Fact 25. The White House owes its permanent name in part to the burning. The sandstone walls of the building had been scorched black by the fire, and when reconstruction began in 1815 under the supervision of architect James Hoban, who had also designed the original building, the exterior stone was painted white to cover the discoloration. While the building had sometimes been referred to casually as the White House before the burning, the paint job and the reconstruction made the nickname so natural and so obvious that it gradually displaced all the other names by which the building had been known, including the President's House and the Executive Mansion. President Theodore Roosevelt made the name official in 1901 when he had it printed on his stationery. James Madison lived out the rest of his presidency in other accommodations while the rebuilding was completed, and the White House was not ready for full occupancy until James Monroe's administration. So one of the most enduring symbols of American governmental permanence and national identity has its name, courtesy of a British arson attack, which is the kind of historical irony that seems too neat to be real, but actually is. Fact 26. While Washington was burning, the British Navy was conducting a sustained campaign of coastal raiding from Maine to Georgia that caused tremendous disruption and suffering to American communities along the Atlantic seaboard. The naval commander primarily responsible for this campaign was Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, who had personal reasons beyond professional duty for wanting to cause maximum damage to the United States. His elder brother, Major Charles Cochrane, had been killed during the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, and Alexander had never forgiven the Americans. He spent the War of 1812 pursuing what amounted to an extraordinarily well-resourced personal vendetta, directing raids on coastal towns, destroying property, encouraging enslaved people to escape to British ships, and generally making life as difficult as possible for the American government and population. Fact 27. One of the most significant and most consistently overlooked aspects of the war was the British offer of freedom to enslaved Americans who escaped to British lines. Cochrane issued a formal proclamation in April 1814 inviting enslaved people who wished to join British forces or to be resettled in a British colony to come aboard any British vessel. Thousands responded, escaping plantations and farms across the Chesapeake and southern coastal regions. The British were true to their word in a meaningful sense. Those who reached British ships were not returned to slavery. Many served in the Colonial Marines, a military unit composed entirely of formerly enslaved men who fought with notable effectiveness in several engagements, including the attack on Washington. Others were resettled in Nova Scotia, Trinidad, and Bermuda. After the war, the American government demanded that Britain return the escaped people or pay compensation. Britain refused to return anyone, arguing that they had been promised their freedom and that freedom once given could not be revoked. A long diplomatic dispute about monetary compensation eventually produced some payments, but the money went to the former enslavers rather than to the people who had actually been enslaved. Fact 28. The Battle of Lake Erie in September 1813 was one of the most decisive American victories of the entire war, and it was planned and executed by a 28-year-old naval officer named Oliver Hazard Perry, who had never commanded a fleet in a major battle before. Perry had spent months in the previous year supervising the construction of the ships he would fight with, watching over the building process, dealing with supply shortages, and managing a workforce that was often sick, undertrained, or both. When the battle came, he fought his flagship Lawrence to complete destruction before transferring to another vessel, under fire in a small rowboat, crossing open water while under enemy guns, and then rallying the rest of his squadron to win a complete victory. His dispatch to General William Henry Harrison afterward was brief, clear, and has been quoted ever since. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Fact 29. Perry named his flagship Lawrence in honor of a fellow naval officer, Captain James Lawrence, who had been killed earlier in the summer of 1813 while commanding the USS Chesapeake in a losing battle against HMS Shannon. Lawrence was hit by musket fire during the engagement and died of his wounds, but not before uttering the words that became his permanent memorial: "Don't give up the ship." Perry had those words embroidered on a blue battle flag that he flew from the Lawrence's mast at Lake Erie. The flag created an interesting situation during the battle when the Lawrence was shot to pieces and became indefensible, requiring Perry to transfer to another ship rather than continue fighting with a vessel that could no longer fight effectively. He did not technically give up the ship, since it was never captured, and he eventually recaptured it in the aftermath of the battle. But the sequence of events gave the flag's motto a somewhat ironic dimension that Perry himself probably noticed. Fact 30. The Battle of Lake Champlain in September 1814 is considered by serious historians to be arguably the most strategically important American victory of the entire war, even though it receives only a fraction of the popular attention given to New Orleans or the Constitution's frigate victories. A major British invasion force had assembled in Canada with the intention of pushing deep into New York State and possibly as far as Albany, which would have given Britain a powerful bargaining chip in the ongoing peace negotiations. The invasion's success depended on control of Lake Champlain, and the American naval squadron under Master Commandant Thomas MacDonough won a decisive victory through careful preparation and brilliant tactical improvisation during the battle itself. When news of the defeat reached the British peace negotiators in Ghent, it significantly altered the negotiating dynamic. Without a major victory on American soil to point to, Britain's position for demanding territorial concessions evaporated. Fact 31. The peace negotiations in Ghent were a prolonged exercise in mutual frustration and slowly collapsing ambitions. Both sides began with maximalist positions they had no realistic prospect of achieving. The British initially demanded the creation of a substantial, independent indigenous state in the American Midwest as a permanent buffer zone, the cession of portions of Maine to Canada to improve communications between the maritime provinces and Quebec, and various other territorial adjustments. The Americans initially insisted on a formal end to impressment, the recognition of a broad definition of neutral rights at sea, and other demands that Britain was categorically unwilling to accept. As months passed, military events kept shifting the balance, and both sides gradually discovered that their original demands were impossible and their backup positions were barely more achievable. Fact 32. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, which gives the document a certain festive association entirely at odds with its rather anticlimactic contents. The treaty restored all conquered territories and resolved none of the original issues that had made the war ostensibly necessary. The impressment question was simply dropped from the negotiating table, partly because the end of the Napoleonic Wars had removed the immediate need for British impressment, and partly because neither side could agree on terms. Boundaries were restored to their pre-war positions. An arbitration commission was established to resolve ongoing border disputes. It was, in essence, a document that acknowledged that both sides had been fighting for 2.5 years, had spent enormous money and lost many lives, and had decided to stop doing so without resolving the questions that had started the whole enterprise. History has produced few more thoroughly inconclusive pieces of diplomacy. Fact 33. The most famous battle of the entire war took place on January 8th, 1815, which was approximately 2 weeks after the peace treaty had been signed in Ghent. The Battle of New Orleans was a spectacular American military achievement in which Andrew Jackson's defending force inflicted over 2,000 casualties on a British attacking force while suffering fewer than 100 themselves, a lopsided result that would stand as one of the most one-sided battle outcomes in the history of warfare between comparable professional forces. The British attacked in massed formation, across open ground against Jackson's prepared defensive earthworks, a tactical decision that has puzzled military historians ever since, because it combined the worst aspects of the assault with none of the advantages that might have made it work. Pakenham, the British commander, apparently expected that the speed and discipline of his veterans would carry them across the killing ground before accurate American fire could stop them. He was catastrophically wrong. The Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen behind Jackson's lines could hit individual targets at ranges that British soldiers were not trained to fire at accurately, and the effect of their fire on the advancing columns was devastating. The two main British assault columns were essentially destroyed before they reached the American position. It was also, in terms of affecting the outcome of the war, entirely pointless. The war was over. The treaty existed. The news simply had not yet arrived. Both armies went into battle in good faith. Both armies fought with genuine courage, and the men who died did so for a peace that had already been made. Fact 34. The Battle of New Orleans made Andrew Jackson arguably the most famous man in the United States, and gave him the political capital that would eventually carry him to the presidency in 1828. This historical chain of cause and effect deserves a moment of reflection. The most successful American military operation of a war that ended in a diplomatic draw, which occurred after that war was technically over, became the defining military achievement that shaped American political life for a generation. The war itself had been widely criticized, had produced a burning capital, had seen the American army defeated repeatedly in Canada, and had ended in a peace treaty that accomplished nothing specific. By rights, none of it should have been celebrated as a triumph, but New Orleans was real. It was decisive in its immediate local context, and it gave ordinary Americans something they could point to with uncomplicated pride in a conflict that had otherwise provided very little of that. Jackson's New Orleans reputation was powerful enough to outlast the embarrassments of Detroit, Bladensburg, and the burning of Washington, to outlast the memory of a peace treaty that changed nothing, and to make Jackson the defining symbol of American military virtue for the better part of 2 decades. History sometimes rewards the loudest bang rather than the most important one. Fact 35. The British force at New Orleans was commanded by Major General Edward Pakenham, and his identity has an interesting dimension to it. Pakenham was the brother-in-law of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the most celebrated British soldier of the age, and the man who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo earlier that same year. Wellington himself had been offered command of the American campaign and had declined it, saying that he could not promise success given the logistical difficulties and the distance from British supply lines. His assessment proved accurate in a way that must have been particularly painful. His brother-in-law led the assault on Jackson's position, was struck by grape shot and died on the battlefield, and the entire operation collapsed in catastrophic failure. Wellington's military judgment, in both accepting and declining commands, turned out to be consistently better than the government's. Fact 36. The forces defending New Orleans under Jackson's command were one of the most diverse military coalitions assembled in early American history, and the diversity is not always acknowledged in popular tellings of the story. Jackson's defenders included regular United States Army troops, Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen who were extraordinary riflemen, free men of color from New Orleans who formed 2 battalions of color among the most disciplined troops on the field, Choctaw warriors under the leadership of Chief Pushmataha, a contingent of Spanish and French militia from the Louisiana Territory, and the pirates and privateers of Jean Lafitte's band from the Louisiana bayous. These different groups were united primarily by the desire to prevent British troops from capturing New Orleans and the broader Mississippi Valley, and they accomplished the mission with remarkable effectiveness. Fact 37. Jean Lafitte's role in the Battle of New Orleans is one of the more extraordinary stories to emerge from the entire war. Lafitte operated what amounted to a pirate kingdom in the Louisiana bayous, smuggling goods, raiding ships, and conducting his business well outside the law. When the British approached him in September 1814 with an offer of a captain's commission, land grants, and a substantial sum of money in exchange for helping guide their forces through the Louisiana bayous and fighting against the Americans, Lafitte faced a genuine choice that would define his legacy. He chose to turn the British offer over to the American authorities and offer his own services to the defense of New Orleans instead. Andrew Jackson, who had initially dismissed Lafitte as a common criminal, accepted the offer out of military necessity and later praised him and his men for their performance in the battle. President Madison subsequently issued a full pardon to Lafitte and all his men who had fought at New Orleans, making Lafitte quite possibly the only pirate in American history to earn a presidential pardon through military service. Fact 38. The death of Tecumseh and the destruction of his confederation had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. With Tecumseh gone, and with Britain no longer willing or able to support Indigenous resistance after the Ghent peace settlement, the nations of the Great Lakes and Mississippi regions lost the only realistic chance they had of organized, effective resistance to American expansion. The decades that followed the war saw the systematic forced removal of virtually every major indigenous nation east of the Mississippi. The Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of the 5 civilized nations in the late 1830s, was a direct consequence of the political and military landscape created by the War of 1812's outcome. The war's most lasting and most terrible legacy was felt not by the countries that signed the peace treaty, but by the nations who had no seat at the negotiating table. Fact 39. The Battle of Queenston Heights in October. 1812 included one of the most remarkable pieces of military irony in the war. An American force had crossed the Niagara River and captured a commanding position on the heights above the river, a genuinely impressive tactical achievement. The British and Canadian forces, including Isaac Brock himself, launched a counterattack to retake the position. Brock was killed leading the assault, shot by an American rifleman, which was a devastating blow to British morale and to the defense of Upper Canada generally. However, the Americans were eventually driven back to the river, and many were captured. One of the crucial reasons the American force could not be reinforced sufficiently was that a substantial portion of the American militia refused to cross the Niagara River into Canada. They had enlisted to serve on American soil, they explained, and their obligation to the Republic did not extend to invading foreign countries. The legalistic precision of their refusal in the middle of a battle that their comrades were losing has a quality of historical comedy that does not lose its freshness with retelling. Fact 40. Isaac Brock's funeral became one of the most significant public events of the war in Canada. He was buried with full military ceremony at Fort George on the Niagara frontier, and the proceedings drew mourners from across the region, soldiers and civilians alike paying their respects to the man who had arguably saved Upper Canada from American conquest in the war's opening months. Brock had been enormously popular, not just as a commander, but as a person, known for his fairness, his personal courage, and his genuine concern for the civilians under his protection. The grief at his death was real and widespread. The Americans, in what can only be described as a spectacularly misjudged act of military aggression, chose to bombard Fort George during the funeral. The attack was widely condemned even in the United States, where many people found the idea of directing artillery fire at a burial service to be outside the bounds of civilized military conduct, regardless of what war was being fought. Newspapers on both sides of the border reported the incident with varying mixtures of outrage and embarrassment. In Canada, the bombardment of Brock's funeral hardened opinion against the Americans considerably, transforming what had been a mixed and uncertain political attitude in parts of the province into something closer to genuine hostility, and contributing to the narrative of American barbarism that shaped Canadian attitudes toward the war for generations. Brock was eventually memorialized with a tall column on Queenston Heights that stands to this day, visible for miles around, marking the spot where he died. Fact 41. The war generated propaganda campaigns on both sides that varied considerably in their relationship to actual events. American newspapers ran stories about British atrocities that ranged from accurate reporting to outright fabrication, presenting every skirmish as a defense of liberty and every British advance as a descent into barbarism. British publications responded with their own narratives, casting the Americans as ungrateful rebels whose revolutionary pretensions masked naked land hunger. What is particularly interesting is how the propaganda worked on the home fronts. Americans living in New England who had opposed the war from the beginning were reading the same newspapers as Americans in Kentucky who were enthusiastically sending their sons off to fight. The gap between these audiences' beliefs about what the war was and what it was achieving was enormous, which made effective political management of the conflict deeply challenging. Fact 42. The three countries most involved in the War of 1812 have remembered it in three almost completely incompatible ways, and all three sets of memories have persisted into the modern era with remarkable durability. In the United States, the war is remembered primarily through the lens of New Orleans and the Star-Spangled Banner, as a second war of independence in which a young republic held its own against the world's greatest empire. This framing requires careful management of the facts. Detroit, Bladensburg, and the burning of Washington need to be downplayed, and the peace treaty that changed nothing needs to be presented as a kind of moral victory. In Canada, the war is remembered as a heroic defense of British North America against unprovoked American aggression, a foundational story of national identity in which ordinary Canadians stood up and repelled the invaders. This framing also requires selective emphasis. The role of regular British troops and Indigenous warriors needs to be somewhat understated, and the significant number of Canadian civilians who were indifferent or even sympathetic to the Americans needs to be forgotten. In Britain, the war is barely remembered at all, being almost entirely overshadowed by the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo, and the other European dramas that filled the same years. The asymmetry of memory is itself historically revealing. The United States and Canada each found in the war something they needed for their national stories, while Britain found it so peripheral to its real concerns that it required no story at all. Fact 43. One of the most tactically important American naval victories of the war happened not on the Great Lakes or the Atlantic coast, but off the coast of Brazil, far from the scenes of most land fighting. The USS Constitution, under Captain William Bainbridge, engaged and destroyed the British frigate Java in a battle lasting over 2 hours in December 1812. The engagement demonstrated again that the American heavy frigates could defeat British vessels of comparable armament in a sustained fight, a conclusion that the British found deeply uncomfortable. Bainbridge had to burn the Java after the battle because she was too damaged to sail anywhere, which deprived him of the prize money that a surviving captured ship would have earned. The victory was celebrated in the United States with the enthusiasm that good news in a time of bad news always generates, coming as it did in the months after the disaster at Detroit and during a period when American land campaigns were producing little to celebrate. The Java's captain, Henry Lambert, was mortally wounded during the engagement and died shortly after being brought aboard the Constitution as a prisoner, making the victory a reminder that naval combat in the age of sail was deadly even for the losing side's officers. Bainbridge was himself slightly wounded during the action, adding to the physical cost of a victory that the American public received as proof that their navy could hold its own against the greatest maritime power in the world. Fact 44. The British campaign of coastal raiding in the Chesapeake Bay region was sustained throughout much of 1813 and 1814 and was directed primarily by Rear Admiral George Cockburn with a level of enthusiasm that went somewhat beyond what purely military objectives required. Cockburn conducted raids on civilian communities, destroyed property, seized livestock and provisions, and generally made the lives of the people living along the bay extremely unpleasant. He became one of the most hated figures in American popular opinion during the war, with newspapers running cartoons depicting him as a devil, publishing essays demanding his arrest, and at least one account suggesting that a monetary bounty for his capture was proposed. Cockburn was reportedly quite amused by the attention and the hostility, and he continued his raiding operations with considerable personal enjoyment. Fact 45. After the British captured and burned Washington, Admiral Cockburn apparently felt no great urgency to depart and wandered around the ruined capital with a casualness that would have been remarkable even if he were not deep inside enemy territory with a relatively small force. He sat in the speaker's chair in the burned-out House of Representatives. He reportedly picked up a copy of the National Intelligencer newspaper from the office of its editor, who was a particular target of his contempt, and joked that he would keep it as a souvenir of his visit to Washington. He asked bystanders if they had any complaints about the conduct of his men. He conducted himself, in short, as though he were a tourist rather than a military commander in a position of considerable vulnerability, which suggests either extraordinary personal sang-froid or a complete absence of concern about what the Americans might do in response, both of which were probably somewhat justified, given what had happened at Bladensburg. Fact 46. Both sides in the war made early use of what modern military doctrine would call information operations, attempts to influence the beliefs and morale of enemy soldiers and civilians through non-kinetic means. The British issued proclamations to American citizens in occupied areas, promising good treatment to those who remained peaceable and harsher consequences to those who resisted. They offered land grants and cash to American soldiers who would desert and come over to the British side. They circulated papers among indigenous nations arguing that the Americans intended to exterminate all native peoples and that only Britain could protect their interests. The Americans made parallel offers to Canadian militia, suggesting that those who laid down their arms and went home would be treated as non-combatants and that their property would be respected. They also issued proclamations to the French-speaking population of Lower Canada, suggesting that their fellow Republicans in the United States had natural sympathies with a people who had suffered under British colonial rule. The success rate of both programs was limited. Most soldiers on both sides proved resistant to desertion appeals, and the civilian populations were generally more interested in defending their actual communities than in responding to the ideological appeals of foreign armies. But the existence of these campaigns demonstrates that military planners on both sides already understood that war was fought in the psychological and informational domain as well as the physical one, an understanding that would be further developed in every conflict that followed. Fact 47. The war's southern frontier produced some of its stranger episodes when American forces began operating in the Spanish territory of Florida, which was technically neutral in the conflict between Britain and the United States. Spain was simultaneously fighting alongside Britain against Napoleon in Europe and trying to maintain neutrality in the American War, a position of considerable diplomatic awkwardness. The British used Spanish Florida as a base of operations for supplying indigenous allies and for projecting power into the Gulf Coast region. Andrew Jackson eventually invaded East Florida in 1814, on the grounds that he could not allow it to be used as a staging area for attacks on American territory, an argument that was legally creative but militarily sensible. Spain's ability to object was constrained by the fact that it could not actually defend its own territory from either the Americans or the British. Fact 48. The opposition to the war in New England was so intense and so organized that it created a genuine crisis of national unity that contemporaries treated as a potential threat to the survival of the United States as a single political entity. New England merchants had built their prosperity on trade with Britain and with British Canada, and the war cut both of those trade relationships simultaneously. Some merchants openly continued trading with British Canada throughout the war, supplying the enemy with food and goods in exchange for money, a practice that was technically treasonous but practically very difficult to stop. The Hartford Convention of late 1814, at which New England Federalists met in Connecticut to formally articulate their grievances about the war and about their underrepresentation in national politics, was widely perceived as possibly leading toward secession negotiations. The convention ultimately proposed constitutional amendments rather than secession, but the spectacle of an American region openly organizing against a national war effort, while that war was ongoing, was deeply alarming to Madison's administration and to Union supporters generally. Fact 49. The most enduring cultural artifact produced by the War of 1812 was created almost by accident by a man who had gone to negotiate a prisoner release and ended up watching a battle from a British ship. Francis Scott Key was a Georgetown lawyer who had gone out to the British fleet in the Chesapeake to negotiate the release of an American civilian, Dr. William Beans, who had been arrested by the British for allegedly inciting resistance among civilians. Key secured Beans' release, but was then told he would have to remain with the British fleet until after the planned attack on Fort McHenry was completed. since he had seen and heard information about British plans that the British did not want shared. He watched the night-long bombardment from a vessel in the harbor, and when dawn revealed that the American flag was still flying over the fort, he was moved to write a poem about the experience on the back of a letter he had in his pocket. The poem, set to the tune of a British drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven, was published in a Baltimore newspaper 4 days later and became an immediate sensation. Fact 50. The bombardment of Fort McHenry that inspired the national anthem was a substantial military operation by any measure. British naval vessels fired somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 explosive shells, bombs, and rockets at the fort over a period of approximately 25 hours. The fort's garrison of around 1,000 men could do relatively little in return, since the British ships were positioned at a distance that kept them safely beyond effective range of the fort's guns, while allowing them to lob shells into the fortification's interior. The primary reason Washington's defense succeeded where Washington's defense had failed was that the shallow waters of the Patapsco River, reinforced by American gunboats, prevented the British ships from moving close enough to the fort to fire with the accuracy that would have been necessary to destroy it. The British eventually concluded that the fort could not be reduced at acceptable cost and withdrew. Fact 51. The weapons called rockets in the Star-Spangled Banner were not metaphors or poetic embellishments. They were actual military rockets, specifically the Congreve rocket, a weapon developed by the British officer William Congreve, based on military rockets he had observed being used by Indian forces in Mysore. The Congreve rocket was essentially a large metal tube filled with propellant and fitted with an explosive or incendiary warhead, launched from a stick or a tube and streaking through the air with a trail of fire and sparks. They were notoriously inaccurate, which limited their effectiveness against specific targets, but their visual and auditory impact on troops who had never encountered them before could be significant. The phrase, "rockets, red glare," in the anthem captures the visual reality of these weapons quite precisely. They did produce a distinctive red light as they burned in flight. Fact 52. The enormous flag that Francis Scott Key saw flying over Fort McHenry on the morning after the bombardment had been made at Key's specific request. The garrison commander, Major George Armistead, had wanted a flag large enough to be visible from a great distance, ensuring that anyone watching from the bay would be able to see whether the fort had fallen or held. He commissioned the flag from a Baltimore seamstress named Mary Pickersgill, who created both the enormous garrison flag, measuring 30 feet by 42 feet, and a smaller storm flag of 17 by 25 feet. The garrison flag was so large that Pickersgill could not lay it out in her own home and reportedly used the floor of a nearby brewery to do the finishing work. She charged $405.90 for her labor, which was a substantial professional fee. The flag that survived the bombardment is now on permanent display at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington. Fact 53. The Battle of Plattsburgh, fought on September 11th, 1814, was simultaneous on land and water, with the land battle serving primarily as a holding action, while the decisive naval engagement took place on Lake Champlain. The British naval force was commanded by Captain George Downey, who was killed early in the battle, and the American squadron was commanded by Master Commandant Thomas McDonough, who had positioned his vessels with characteristic forethought to allow him to rotate his ships during the engagement and bring fresh guns to bear when one side was damaged. The tactic, called winding or kedging, required significant preparation and precise execution under fire, and it worked. The British naval defeat made the land campaign impossible to continue, and the entire invasion withdrew. The battle's effect on the peace negotiations in Ghent was arguably greater than any other single engagement of the war. Fact 54. The instruction, "Don't give up the ship," has an interesting persistence in American naval culture that goes somewhat beyond what the actual circumstances of its origin would seem to warrant. James Lawrence, who said it while dying aboard the losing Chesapeake in June 1813, was an officer who had just lost a battle to HMS Shannon in one of the Royal Navy's most impressive frigate victories of the war. The Shannon's captain, Philip Broke, had spent years training his crew to shoot accurately and work together with precision that was unusual for the period, and his ship's gunnery destroyed the Chesapeake in just 11 minutes of close-range combat. Lawrence was wounded fatally and carried below, reportedly calling out his famous instruction as he was taken from the deck. Oliver Perry then had the words embroidered on a blue battle flag that he flew from his mast at Lake Erie, where his flagship was subsequently shot to pieces and he had to abandon it. He did not give up the ship in the sense of surrendering it, since he transferred his flag under fire and continued the battle until victory, but the sequence of events gave the phrase a dimension of irony that the phrase's admirers prefer not to dwell on. The flag survived the battle, and Perry kept it as one of his most prized possessions. Yet the phrase has endured for over 2 centuries as an inspirational motto, appearing on naval flags, in official ceremonies, and in cultural references to naval courage. The gap between the phrase's inspirational meaning and the complicated reality of its origin is one of the small but telling ways in which war creates mythology that diverges from the events that generated it. Fact 55. The war had lasting effects on American economic development that its immediate military failures obscure. The British naval blockade cut American merchants off from the British manufactured goods and British markets they had been deeply dependent on since independence. This disruption, while painful in the short term, forced American investors and entrepreneurs to put money into domestic manufacturing at a rate that would not otherwise have occurred so quickly. New England textile mills, iron foundries, and other manufacturing enterprises received capital that might otherwise have gone into the safer investment of the carrying trade. The industrial transformation of New England, which was already underway before the war, accelerated significantly because of it, and some historians argue that the war compressed a decade or more of industrial development into 2 years of enforced economic self-sufficiency. Fact 56. One of the more peculiar American military disasters of the war was the Penobscot expedition of 1779. Wait, that was actually the Revolutionary War. But the War of 1812 produced its own Penobscot embarrassment, when British forces captured much of the Maine district of Massachusetts and held it for the duration of the war, with the local population essentially accommodating itself to British occupation with remarkably little resistance. The British established a functioning administration in the occupied territory, collected customs duties, and maintained order. Many locals continued their normal economic activities, including trading with British Canada. The episode illustrated both the weakness of American military power in 1814 and the ambivalence of many New Englanders toward the war they had never wanted. Fact 57. The Royal Navy's blockade of the American coastline tightened progressively as the war continued, and by the middle of 1814, it had reduced American overseas trade to a trickle and was causing significant economic distress across the country. The blockade's geographic application was deliberately strategic rather than uniform. New England, whose commercial and political leaders had opposed the war most visibly, was initially excluded from the blockade as a British attempt to encourage separatist sentiment and possibly to bring New England toward a negotiated separate peace. The strategy showed signs of working, as New England's economy remained relatively functional while the rest of the country suffered. When it became apparent that New England separatism was becoming more seriously discussed, the British included northern ports in the blockade as well, apparently concluding that helping break up the United States was more complicated and uncertain than simply winning the war. Fact 58. The defense of Sackett's Harbor in New York in May 1813 demonstrated both the potential effectiveness of American defensive operations and the dangers of excessive zeal under pressure. A British force attacked the important American naval base on Lake Ontario, where several warships were under construction. The American commander ordered the naval storehouses and the partially completed ships to be burned if the British looked likely to capture them. During the battle, as British forces pushed forward, an officer interpreted the order as applying immediately and set fire to a nearly completed warship, the Sir Isaac Brock, along with the naval stores. The British were eventually repulsed and withdrew. The premature burning of the warship was a significant own goal, and the officer responsible was officially reprimanded, though his error was understandable given the chaos of the moment. Fact 59. The treatment of prisoners during the war was inconsistent enough to become a genuine source of diplomatic friction between the two governments. American sailors held in British prisons, including the notorious Dartmoor prison in Devon, experienced conditions ranging from tolerable to deeply unpleasant, depending on the period and the administration. British prisoners held in American facilities fared similarly variably. Both governments periodically accused the other of deliberately delaying prisoner exchange negotiations to use captives as leverage, and the accusations were probably accurate on both sides. The Dartmoor massacre of April 1815, in which British guards fired on American prisoners who were rioting over food quality, and the delay in their repatriation after the war ended, killing several and wounding dozens, became a lasting source of American grievance that took years of diplomatic management to diffuse. Fact 60. The Battle of Lundy's Lane, fought on the night of July 25th and into the early hours of July 26th, 1814, was one of the most brutal and disorienting engagements of the entire war. Both sides stumbled toward each other in the darkness near Niagara Falls, close enough that the roar of the falls competed with the sound of gunfire, and the fighting became so confused at close quarters that units from different armies were sometimes firing at each other from distances of only a few feet. The American forces briefly captured a battery of British guns at the center of the British position, which seemed like a decisive advantage, but were unable to hold them under the British counterattack. The guns were recaptured, then attacked again, then held by the British. When dawn came, both armies had suffered so heavily that neither could continue, and they both withdrew. Both sides claim victory, which in a battle that ends in mutual exhaustion is perhaps the only honest description available. Fact 61. The young American officer Winfield Scott fought at Lundy's Lane with the kind of conspicuous personal courage that was simultaneously admirable and somewhat reckless, and his performance there contributed to what would become one of the longest and most consequential careers in American military history. Scott had his horse shot out from under him during the battle, was severely wounded in the left shoulder, and only barely escaped capture. He was taken from the field in serious condition and spent months recovering. He went on to serve as commanding general of the United States Army for 20 years, to design the basic military training and organization that shaped the Army through the Civil War, to serve as the general-in-chief at the outbreak of that war before his age made continuation impossible, and to run for president in 1852. The wound he received at Lundy's Lane troubled him for the rest of his life. Fact 62. The militia system that both sides relied on produced results so variable that drawing general conclusions about militia effectiveness becomes nearly impossible. Of the same type of unit in different circumstances, with different leadership and different levels of motivation, could be the decisive force that held a position or the running mob that abandoned it. The disaster at Bladensburg was militia-driven, with units breaking and fleeing before the British advance, despite having defensive positions and artillery support. The defense of New Orleans was substantially militia-driven, with Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen proving among the most effective fighters on either side in the entire war. The surrendered garrison at Detroit was a mix of regulars and militia, whose performance was largely determined by the behavior of their commander. The American militia who refused to cross into Canada at Queenston Heights did so citing the letter of their legal enlistment agreements, which was legally defensible and militarily catastrophic simultaneously. The war's central military lesson about militia was not that they were good or bad, but that they were entirely dependent on context, morale, leadership, and the nature of the task being asked of them, in ways that made them unpredictable as the foundation of a national defense strategy. A well-led militia defending their own homes and communities could be formidable. An ill-led militia being asked to march into foreign territory for purposes they did not fully understand or support could dissolve in minutes. The trick was knowing in advance which you had, and neither side was particularly good at that prediction. Fact 63. The naval arms race on the Great Lakes during the war reached levels of absurdity that contemporaries found almost as remarkable as modern historians do. Both sides were felling trees, cutting planks, and building warships simultaneously on opposite shores of lakes and rivers, racing to achieve naval superiority on waters that neither side had needed a war fleet on before 1812. Ships were sometimes launched and sent into battle before their fitting out was complete, with guns being installed while the vessels were under sail toward an engagement. Sailors were recruited from places that had no naval tradition and taught the basics of seamanship in weeks rather than years. The improvised quality of the lake navies on both sides was remarkable, and the fact that they fought effective battles under these conditions says something about the adaptability and competence of the officers who commanded them. Fact 64. The complete destruction of HMS Guerriere by the USS Constitution in August 1812 was more than a military victory. It was a symbolic event of enormous psychological importance. The Guerriere had been known in American ports because her crew had impressment. American sailors, making her a personal symbol of British arrogance and American helplessness. When the Constitution reduced her to a hulk that had to be burned at sea, it transformed a symbol of humiliation into one of revenge, which resonated deeply with the American public. Captain Isaac Hull, who commanded the Constitution, was celebrated as a hero, on a scale that must have been somewhat bewildering, given that he had done what American naval officers were supposed to do. Congress voted him a gold medal, the highest honor it could bestow, and the citizens of Boston threw him a series of banquets that reportedly occupied several days. Fact 65. General James Wilkinson's attempted descent of the Saint. Lawrence River toward Montreal in November 1813 was one of the more comprehensively mismanaged military operations of the entire war, and it was managed by one of the more comprehensively dubious figures in American military history. The plan, in theory, was sound. A large American force moving down the St. Lawrence could threaten Montreal from the west, while another force threatened it from the south, potentially compelling its surrender. In practice, the operation was plagued by poor organization, bad weather, inadequate boats, supply problems, and a commander whose health was poor and whose commitment to the operation's success was questionable. When a British force significantly smaller than his rearguard attacked at Chrysler's Farm and fought the rearguard to a standstill, Wilkinson used this inconclusive engagement as justification to abandon the entire campaign and go into winter quarters, the attack on Montreal having apparently become impractical. Fact 66. James Wilkinson's military career was a monument to the proposition that personal connections and political skills could substitute for competence and integrity in the early American Republic. Wilkinson had been on the secret payroll of the Spanish government as Agent 13 for years, receiving regular payments in exchange for intelligence about American military activities and policy. He had been involved in the Aaron Burr conspiracy to detach parts of the American West into a separate nation or empire. He had been court-martialed twice and acquitted both times despite substantial evidence of misconduct. He had a reputation throughout the Army for vanity, incompetence, and financial corruption that was so widespread it had become a kind of dark joke. That this man commanded a major American army in wartime reflects the combination of political patronage, organizational chaos, and simple shortage of alternatives that characterized the early American military establishment. Fact 67. The war saw significant tactical innovation on both sides, with commanders adapting to the specific conditions of North American warfare in ways that diverge from European practice. The extensive use of light infantry and skirmishers, the importance of Indigenous scouts and guides, the role of fortified positions in compensating for numerical inferiority, and the challenges of operating in dense forest and across major water obstacles all required adaptations that European training manuals did not fully address. American commanders who had experience on the frontier adapted more naturally to these conditions than those who came from purely European military backgrounds, which partly explains why some of the most effective American performances in the war came from forces with substantial militia and frontier elements. The war also produced some early examples of what we might call combined arms thinking, with commanders on both sides learning to coordinate the effects of artillery, infantry, and naval gunfire in ways that went beyond the simple juxtaposition of different weapon types. Jackson's defensive arrangements at New Orleans were particularly sophisticated in this regard, creating interlocking fields of fire that made the British assault geometrically impossible to execute without catastrophic losses. The British, on several occasions, demonstrated impressive coordination between naval gunfire and land operations during their Chesapeake raids. These tactical lessons were absorbed by the armies of both nations and influenced the military thinking of the generations that followed, contributing to the development of the combined arms doctrine that would define warfare in the following century. Fact 68. The myth of the Canadian militia as the primary defenders of Canada against American invasion became one of the foundational stories of Canadian national identity. And like most foundational stories, it contained important elements of truth embedded in a narrative framework that somewhat simplified reality. The militia did serve, often effectively and with genuine courage. Farmers and shopkeepers who had no military experience did take up arms and contribute to the defense of their communities, but they did so alongside British regular troops who provided the professional military backbone of the defense, Indigenous warriors who contributed crucial intelligence, scouting, and combat power, and a geographic and logistical reality that made the American invasions difficult regardless of who was defending. The myth is not false, it is incomplete, and the incompleteness served the purpose of building a national identity that emphasized civilian virtue and self-reliance. Fact 69. The speed and audacity of the British strike on Washington impressed military observers on both sides and influenced thinking about expeditionary warfare for years afterward. General Ross's force marched from the Chesapeake landing area to Washington and back in approximately a week, conducting the burning and withdrawal in the space of roughly 24 hours in the capital itself. The operation succeeded because it was fast, because American defensive arrangements were inadequate, and because the psychological effect on the American government and population was disproportionate to the physical damage done. The White House and the Capitol building could be rebuilt, and they were. But the political and psychological effect of a foreign army walking into the national capital and burning it could not be as easily repaired. The British had demonstrated that the American interior was vulnerable to a well-conducted raid, even against a nation that was theoretically defending its own homeland, a lesson that had implications for American military planning that were reflected in the subsequent decisions to fortify coastal areas and invest in naval power. The operation also demonstrated the limitations of militia as a defense against professional soldiers. The militia at Bladensburg had numerical advantages, defensive terrain, and artillery support, and they still broke and ran. The memory of that failure drove debates about American military organization for the next several decades, eventually contributing to the reforms that produced a more professionalized and better trained regular army in the years following the conflict. Fact 70. John Armstrong's tenure as Secretary of War during the burning of Washington became one of the more spectacular examples of a cabinet officer failing upward in American political history. Armstrong had consistently and publicly dismissed warnings about the vulnerability of Washington, had failed to organize adequate defenses, and had been absent from effective decision-making during the crisis. The public outrage after the burning was so intense and so specifically directed at him that he had no choice but to resign. His replacement was James Monroe, already serving as Secretary of State, who took on both positions simultaneously for a period while the government tried to recover its footing. Monroe handled both roles competently, enough to emerge from the crisis with his reputation enhanced, which contributed to his election as president in 1816. The burning of the Capitol thus, indirectly, produced a president, which was not the outcome the British had intended. Fact 71. The parallel war against the Creek Nation in the South produced one of the war's most decisive and most brutal American military victories at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March 1814. Jackson's combined force of regulars, Tennessee and Georgia militia, and Cherokee and Lower Creek allies attacked a fortified Red Stick position on a bend of the Tallapoosa River in what is now Alabama. The Red Sticks had built a formidable wooden breastwork across the neck of the Horseshoe Bend, expecting to fight a frontal battle. Jackson's Cherokee allies swam the river to attack from the rear, while his main force attacked the breastwork. Approximately 800 Red Stick warriors were killed in the engagement and its immediate aftermath, making it one of the most lethal single engagements of the entire war in terms of Indigenous casualties. The battle effectively ended Red Stick resistance and produced a peace treaty that took over 20 million acres of Creek land. Fact 72. The story of Junaluska and Andrew Jackson stands as one of the most poignant ironies produced by the entire conflict. Junaluska was a Cherokee warrior who fought alongside Jackson at Horseshoe Bend, and who, according to accounts that have been passed down through Cherokee oral history, saved Jackson's life during the battle by killing a Red Stick warrior who was about to strike the general from behind. Jackson allegedly said to Junaluska afterward, in words that would echo through the following decades with bitter irony, that as long as the sun shone, he would be his friend. Less than 20 years later, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced removal of the Cherokee and other nations from their homelands in the southeastern United States. The Trail of Tears, which killed thousands of Cherokee people during the forced march to Indian Territory, followed. Junaluska survived the march. He reportedly said that if he had known what Jackson would do, he would not have saved his life at Horseshoe Bend. Fact 73. The experience of American prisoners held in Britain provided some of the war's most vivid and least celebrated individual stories of hardship and endurance. Prisoners were transported across the Atlantic in conditions that were difficult at best and genuinely dangerous at worst, held in facilities at Dartmoor and other locations in Devon that were cold, crowded, and disease-prone, and kept waiting for repatriation long after the war officially ended. The Dartmoor Massacre of April 6, 1815, occurred when British guards fired into a crowd of American prisoners who had broken into a storage area in what the prisoners said was a search for food and what the prison authorities described as a riot. 7 Americans were killed and more than 30 wounded. A subsequent inquiry reached a conclusion that most Americans found unsatisfying, attributing the guards' conduct to panic rather than deliberate cruelty. The incident generated significant diplomatic protest and was remembered in the United States as an example of British brutality for years afterward. Fact 74. The war destroyed the Federalist Party as a national political force in the United States, which was one of its more consequential domestic political effects. The Federalists had opposed the war from the beginning, predicting accurately that it would be expensive, unsuccessful, and harmful to American commercial interests. But when the war ended with the victory at New Orleans providing a gloss of triumph over the preceding embarrassments, the Federalist anti-war position looked less like prescient caution and more like disloyal obstructionism. The Hartford Convention, at which New England Federalists had met to discuss their grievances, looked in retrospect like near treason. The party collapsed rapidly after 1815, leaving the Democratic Republicans as essentially the only functioning national political party, a situation that produced its own political dysfunction as factionalism flourished in the absence of organized opposition. Fact 75. The contributions of free black Americans to the war, particularly in the Navy, represent one of the most significant and most consistently underemphasized stories of the conflict. Free black sailors made up a substantial portion of the crews of American naval vessels, with some ships having complements that were 20 to 25% African American. These men served in the same roles as white sailors, received the same pay, and fought with the same courage in engagements that tested everyone on board. Oliver Perry initially complained to naval authorities about the quality of the sailors assigned to him for the Lake Erie campaign, describing them as a motley crew. After the battle, he praised the same men without qualification for their bravery and effectiveness. The contributions of these sailors were systematically marginalized in official histories and popular accounts of the war throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries, a pattern that the historical profession has only begun to fully address in recent decades. Fact 76. American industrial development was given a significant and somewhat ironic boost by the war with Britain. Before the war, American merchants had found it more profitable to import British manufactured goods than to invest in domestic manufacturing, since British factories were more efficient, their products were cheaper, and the carrying trade was reliable. The British naval blockade removed this option for the duration of the war, forcing American consumers to seek domestic alternatives and giving American manufacturers a protected market they had never enjoyed. New England textile manufacturers, iron foundries, glassworks, and other industries expanded rapidly under wartime conditions. When the war ended and British goods flooded back into American markets, some of these industries struggled to compete, leading to demands for protective tariffs that shaped American economic policy for decades. The war had thus created both an industrial capacity and a political constituency for economic nationalism that persisted long after the peace. Fact 77. The Colonial Marines, the unit of formerly enslaved Americans who fought for the British, served with notable effectiveness in several engagements and were described in favorable terms by multiple British officers. They had obvious personal motivations that regular soldiers lacked, having fought their way to freedom and being fully aware of what recapture would mean. They participated in the burning of Washington, in raids along the Chesapeake, and in the assault on Fort Bowyer in Alabama. After the war, the Colonial Marines were resettled in various British territories, rather than returned to the United States. Their story is one of the war's most morally complex narratives, involving freedom, loyalty, military service, and the fundamental contradiction between American ideals of liberty and the institution of slavery that the United States was simultaneously defending and practicing. Fact 78. The Congreve rockets that appeared so dramatically at Bladensburg and in the bombardment of Fort McHenry were a relatively new addition to the British military arsenal, having been developed in the first decade of the 19th century by William Congreve, a military officer and inventor whose enthusiasm for his own creation exceeded what the evidence of their battlefield effectiveness fully justified. The rockets were genuinely frightening to troops who had not encountered them before, producing fire, smoke, noise, and an unpredictable flight path that made them difficult to ignore. Their actual accuracy was poor enough that their military value against specific targets was limited. The rocket units were most useful against massed formations of troops who could not easily disperse, and against buildings and stores that could be set on fire. At Bladensburg, their psychological effect on American militia, who had never seen them, was probably decisive. Fact 79. The British officer Gordon Drummond demonstrated a consistent personal recklessness throughout his command in Upper Canada in 1814 that would in a lesser man have been called suicidal, but which in his case was simply part of his command style. At the Battle of Lundy's Lane, Drummond was struck by a musket ball and wounded significantly, enough that most commanders would have gone to the rear, but he remained on the field and continued directing the battle. A few months later, at the siege of Fort Erie, he was present in the front line when an American sortie struck the British siege lines and detonated a powder magazine, killing hundreds of British soldiers in an explosion that was one of the most lethal single events of the entire war. Drummond survived this as well, apparently making him something of a medical miracle by the standards of 1814, or indeed any other era. Fact 80. The Siege of Fort Erie. In 1814 was the longest sustained engagement on a single position in the entire war, lasting from July through November. An American force under General Jacob Brown held the fort against a series of British attacks, each of which failed at significant cost. The British commander Drummond launched a major assault in mid-August with a force of several thousand men, coordinating attacks on multiple points of the American perimeter. An American defender managed to lure attacking British troops into a magazine that was then detonated, killing and wounding hundreds in an instant and breaking the momentum of the attack. The British withdrew to conduct a formal siege. In September, the Americans launched a massive sortie that destroyed the British siege works and inflicted heavy casualties. In November, with winter approaching and both sides exhausted, the Americans crossed back into New York and destroyed the fort. They had held a position for 4 months at significant cost and then abandoned it voluntarily, successfully defending something they then did not keep. Fact 81. The American Peace Commission at Ghent included some of the most talented politicians and diplomats in the country, and their willingness to exceed and ultimately ignore their instructions from Washington was one of the more consequential acts of unauthorized diplomacy in American history. The commission included John Quincy Adams, who would become president, Henry Clay, who who would become one of the most powerful congressional figures of the 19th century. Albert Gallatin, who had been Secretary of the Treasury and was one of the most intellectually formidable figures in American public life. James Bayard, a senator from Delaware, and Jonathan Russell, a diplomat with European experience. Their original instructions from Secretary of State Monroe required them to make the formal end of impressment a condition of any peace agreement. When they concluded that Britain would never accept this condition, they dropped it from the negotiations without authorization. Their judgment was correct, their initiative was technically insubordinate, and the peace they made was the best available under the circumstances. Fact 82. The personal relationship between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay during the Ghent negotiations illustrated the ways in which effective diplomacy can proceed despite intense personal antipathy between the people conducting it. Adams was a morning person of rigidly puritanical habits who believed that card playing and drinking were forms of moral weakness. Clay was a card player, a drinker, and a man who considered the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. to be among the most productive of any day. Adams would wake at dawn to find Clay's poker game still in progress. Clay would arrive for morning negotiations with the slightly rumpled air of a man who had not yet slept. They found each other, by all accounts, genuinely irritating. They nonetheless managed to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent with professional competence, contributing to one of the less celebrated but more practically important achievements of American diplomacy. Their later rivalry over the 1824 presidential election, in which Adams won the presidency and appointed Clay as Secretary of State in what Jackson called the corrupt bargain, would prove even more acrimonious. Fact 83. The war produced an unexpected diplomatic incident with Portugal when American privateers operating in the Atlantic mistook Portuguese merchant ships for British vessels and attacked them. Portugal was a long-standing British ally and a neutral in the American war, and the attacks caused formal diplomatic protests that the American government had to address with apologies and compensation. The episode illustrated a fundamental problem with privateering warfare as a military strategy. Privateers were financially motivated to attack enemy shipping, which meant they had strong incentives to identify neutral ships as enemy ships when in doubt. The oversight and control problems were significant, and the diplomatic costs were real, even if the privateers' overall contribution to the American war effort was positive. Fact 84. American privateers were arguably the most consistently effective element of the American war effort, doing more measurable damage to British interests than the regular Navy and land forces combined. Hundreds of British merchant ships were captured or destroyed by American privateers operating from ports along the Atlantic coast and from the Caribbean. The impact on British trade was significant enough to drive insurance rates at Lloyd's of London to extraordinary levels for Atlantic voyages. The British press complained bitterly, and British merchants petitioned Parliament for stronger naval protection. The privateering campaign demonstrated that even a nation whose regular navy and army were struggling could hurt a major maritime power by unleashing private incentive on enemy commerce, a lesson that had implications for maritime law and the laws of war that persisted for decades. Fact 85. The story of the General Armstrong in September 1814 deserves more attention than it typically receives. This American privateer was in the neutral Portuguese harbor of File in the Azores when a British naval squadron arrived and, in apparent violation of Portugal's neutrality, began attacking her. The privateer's captain, Samuel Reed, fought off repeated British boat attacks with devastating effectiveness, his crew killing or wounding over 200 British sailors before Reed scuttled his own vessel to prevent capture. The British sustained more casualties in this harbor fight against a single privateer than in many of the war's conventional land battles. Portugal filed diplomatic protest over the violation of its neutral waters that were not fully resolved for generations, and American claims for compensation arising from the British violation of Portuguese neutrality were still being argued in the 19th century. Fact 86. The performance of American armies in the early stages of the war accelerated the development of the United States Military Academy at West Point from a secondary afterthought in American military planning to a central institution of the Professional Officer Corps. West Point had existed since 1802, but had been underfunded, sometimes neglected, and regarded by many politicians as an unnecessary extravagance in a republic whose defense would be provided by citizen militia anyway. The war demonstrated in unmistakable terms what happened when you sent armies into the field led by untrained officers who had no systematic military education, no understanding of supply and logistics, no experience commanding units larger than a company, and no shared professional vocabulary for discussing tactical problems. The political will to invest properly in military education increased substantially as a result. The academy was reorganized and put on a firmer institutional footing after the war, with a revised curriculum, better funding, and a clear understanding of its purpose. Sylvanus Thayer, who served as superintendent from 1817 to 1833, transformed West Point into a genuinely rigorous engineering and military school that produced officers trained to a consistent professional standard. The generation of officers trained at West Point in the 2 decades after 1815 went on to command both the Union and Confederate armies in the Civil War, meaning that the War of 1812's military failures directly and profoundly shaped the quality of military leadership in America's most devastating internal conflict 50 years later. Fact 87. The fate of the Indigenous allies who had fought alongside the British represented the most complete moral failure of the peace negotiations. British diplomats at Ghent made genuine attempts to include protections for Indigenous nations in the treaty, proposing clauses that would guarantee the restoration of territorial rights that existed before the war began. The American negotiators refused categorically, arguing that Indigenous policy within the United States was an internal matter that could not be subject to foreign treaty provisions. Britain, unwilling to allow the protection of Indigenous rights to prevent a peace that was in its broader national interest, ultimately accepted the American position. The Indigenous nations that had allied with Britain in the hope of securing permanent recognition of their territorial rights were in the end simply abandoned. Their abandonment in 1814 made the subsequent campaigns of forced removal not just possible, but inevitable. Fact 88. The submarine inventor and engineer Robert Fulton, who is primarily remembered for his development of practical steamboat navigation, spent part of the War of 1812 trying to convince the American government to fund a radical new naval weapon. His proposed vessel, which he called the Mute, was a steam-powered craft designed to carry explosive charges close to enemy ships and detonate them underwater. It was, in concept, a forerunner of the torpedo boat, and perhaps of the torpedo itself. The American government provided some funding and genuine interest, since the British blockade gave America strong motivation to try anything that might break it. Fulton died in February 1815 before his vessel was completed or tested, and the project died with him. The concept of underwater explosives delivered to ships would not be developed practically until the Civil War, when Confederate engineers built some of the first practical spar torpedoes. Fact 89. The British logistical achievement of sustaining military operations in North America while simultaneously fighting the Napoleonic Wars in Europe was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of the era. Supplying tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors across the Atlantic in a theater thousands of miles from the nearest major base at Halifax required organizational capacity that no other nation in the world could have replicated. The Royal Navy's ability to maintain a blockade, conduct amphibious operations, supply land forces, and project power into the interior of North America simultaneously demonstrated the institutional capabilities that had been built up through decades of global naval activity. The American Navy's inability to challenge this kind of sustained power projection at the strategic level was never truly overcome during the war, even with the individual victories of the heavy frigates. Fact 90. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817, which demilitarized the Great Lakes boundary between the United States and Canada, is one of the most successful arms control agreements in the history of international relations and one of the least celebrated. Negotiated between Acting Secretary of State Richard Rush and British Minister Charles Bagot, the agreement limited each side to a small number of small armed vessels on the Great Lakes, eliminating the heavily armed fleets that both sides had built during the war. The agreement has been maintained, modified, and extended for over 2 centuries, and the result is that the longest undefended international border in the world runs along the same lakes where American and British sailors killed each other in the War of 1812. The border is today the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, a transformation that would have seemed inconceivable to the men who fought at Lake Erie or Lake Champlain. Fact 91. American popular culture after the war created a story of the conflict that bore an increasingly loose relationship to the actual military record. The narrative of the Second War of Independence, in which a plucky young republic stood up to the British Empire and emerged victorious, was cultivated through songs, stories, political speeches, and the selective memory of which battles were worth commemorating. New Orleans was celebrated. Detroit was forgotten. The Constitution's victories were memorialized. Bladensburg was not. The burning of Washington was reframed as evidence of British desperation rather than American military failure. The result was a national story about the war that was neither wholly false nor wholly honest, which is true of most nations' stories about their wars, but which was sufficiently detached from reality to sometimes surprise historians encountering it. Fact 92. The war produced 2 American presidents, 1 vice president, and several senators and congressmen from its roster of military commanders, making it one of the more politically productive conflicts in American history in terms of generating political careers. Andrew Jackson became the 7th president, winning elections in 1828 and 1832 on the strength of a political persona built almost entirely around his New Orleans victory and his image as a tough frontier warrior who was not beholden to the Eastern establishment. William Henry Harrison became the 9th president in 1840, running on the slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which referenced his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, an engagement that predated the war but was directly connected to the same frontier conflicts. Harrison had the shortest presidency in American history, dying of pneumonia after 31 days in office, which at least spared him the kinds of complications that Jackson's longer tenure produced. Richard Mentor Johnson became Martin Van Buren's vice president on the strength of his claim to have personally killed Tecumseh, which illustrates how currency, a single dramatic military anecdote, could have in the politics of the era. Winfield Scott, who had fought through the entire war and emerged as one of its few consistently impressive American commanders, ran for president in 1852, losing to Franklin Pierce. The pattern of military heroes leveraging wartime reputation into political careers was deeply embedded in American political culture, and the War of 1812 reinforced it at a critical moment in the Republic's development. Fact 93. Military intelligence during the war was often so poor on both sides that commanding officers were making major strategic decisions based on information that was days old, wildly inaccurate, or had been simply invented by scouts who had not actually observed what they claimed to have seen. American commanders were regularly surprised by British movements that should have been predictable. British commanders made equally consequential intelligence errors. The case of the Battle of New Orleans is instructive. The British spent weeks probing the approaches to the city before their main assault, yet their attack plan apparently did not adequately account for the strength of Jackson's defensive works or the quality of the Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen defending them. The gap between intelligence available and decisions made was a structural problem that neither side solved. Fact 94. The tradition of giving American military commanders affectionate nicknames based on their personal qualities or their most famous military achievements was significantly reinforced by the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson was Old Hickory. William Henry Harrison was Old Tippecanoe, later shortened to just Tippecanoe for political purposes. Winfield Scott would later be called Old Fuss and Feathers for his punctilious attention to military ceremony, uniform regulations, and the proper forms of military address, qualities that his men found simultaneously irritating and reassuring. Zachary Taylor, who served in the war in relatively minor roles as a young officer, but went on to command in the Mexican War and eventually to the presidency, was called Old Rough and Ready for his informal habits, willingness to share the same rough conditions as his soldiers, and his general disdain for the military formalities that Scott loved so much. The nickname served a political function as well as a social one. In an era before mass photography and electronic media, a vivid nickname was one of the primary ways a military figure's persona could be communicated to a broad electorate that had never seen the man in person. Nicknaming packaged military reputations in memorable form for public consumption distinguished one general hero from another in the minds of voters who might not follow the details of military campaigns, and gave ordinary citizens a sense of personal familiarity with figures they had never met. The War of 1812 veterans who used their military nicknames in subsequent political campaigns were implicitly arguing that a man who had proven himself in the field had qualities that translated directly into civil leadership. Fact 95. The War of 1812 paradoxically improved the long-term relationship between Britain and the United States in ways that might not have happened without the shared experience of a costly and inconclusive conflict. Both governments had learned that war between them was ruinously expensive, that neither could achieve decisive victory against the other in the North American theater, and that the commercial relationship between the two countries was more valuable than any territorial or political objective either might hope to achieve by fighting. The decades after 1815 saw a gradual normalization of relations, a series of successful arbitrations of boundary disputes, and the beginning of what would eventually become a strategic partnership. None of this was inevitable or immediate, but the memory of the war's futility helped each side's decision-makers resist future provocations that in other circumstances might have led to renewed conflict. Fact 96. The boundary settlements that grew from the post-war arbitration process eventually produced the definitive northern boundary of the continental United States, one of the most consequential geographic agreements in North American history. The 49th parallel, which forms the border from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast, was established by a series of agreements beginning with the Convention of 1818, which fixed the boundary from the Lake of the Woods to the Rocky Mountains, and culminating in the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which extended the line to the Pacific coast. This meant that the War of 1812, which had failed to produce any boundary changes when it ended, and whose peace treaty explicitly restored the pre-war status quo, indirectly contributed to the definitive establishment of the American-Canadian border by creating the diplomatic framework and the accumulated goodwill that made peaceful boundary settlement possible over the following 3 decades. The boundary arbitrations were not always easy. There were moments in the 1830s and 1840s when disputes over territory in Maine, Oregon, and other areas threatened to produce a new conflict. But the habit of arbitration, rather than armed confrontation, established in the years after 1815, proved durable enough to survive these crises. The map of North America today, with its remarkably straight and peaceful northern border, running for nearly 4,000 miles from the Atlantic to the Pacific, reflects the long shadow of a war that formally changed nothing, but practically changed everything about how the two countries chose to manage their shared continent. Fact 97. The effect of the war on Canadian identity was profound and lasting, in ways that go beyond the simple narrative of military victory. Before the war, Upper Canada in particular was a province of very uncertain loyalties, with a substantial population of American-born settlers who had no particular attachment to the British connection, and who might have been as happy under American governance as under British colonial administration. The shared experience of fighting off American invasion, whatever its complicated reality, created among those who went through it a sense of common purpose and common identity that had not previously existed. The communities that had defended their farms and their towns from American armies felt a connection to each other and to the idea of Canada that was new and that proved durable. The myth of the loyal militia defense became the founding story of a nation that would not officially exist until 1867, but whose identity was already being shaped in 1812. Fact 98. The Star-Spangled Banner's journey from newspaper poem to national anthem took over a century of informal adoption before it received official status. After its publication in 1814, the song was popular, widely known, and frequently sung at patriotic occasions. It was adopted by the Army and the Navy for use at official ceremonies in the 1890s, and it was played at the 1916 World Series, which helped cement its association with major public events. But it did not become the official national anthem of the United States until Congress passed the National Anthem Act on March 4th, 1931, when President Herbert Hoover signed it into law. For the first 117 years of its existence, the song was simply a very popular patriotic anthem competing with several others, including My Country, 'Tis of Thee and America, the Beautiful for the status of national musical symbol. Fact 99. The final, most perfectly self-contained irony of the entire War of 1812 is the completeness with which it failed to accomplish anything that the people who started it wanted, while simultaneously becoming one of the most mythologized and selectively remembered conflicts in North American history. The United States wanted to stop impressment, which ended because the Napoleonic Wars ended. The United States wanted to expand into Canada, which it did not do. Britain wanted to maintain trade restrictions, which it had already lifted before the war began. Britain wanted to protect Indigenous allies, whom it abandoned in the peace treaty. The Indigenous nations wanted recognition of their territorial rights, which they did not receive and would never receive. The borders were unchanged. The trade disputes were eventually resolved by diplomacy. The peace treaty said essentially that nothing that had happened in the previous 2.5 years needed to be remembered. Yet the war is recalled in the United States as a triumph, in Canada as a heroic founding moment, and is barely recalled at all in Britain, where it was always a minor sideshow to the main European drama. 3 countries, 3 incompatible memories, one war that ended in a draw, whose most famous battle was fought after the peace had been signed. If history has a sense of humor, the War of 1812 is one of its better jokes. From Isaac Brock's legendary bluff at Detroit to Dolly, Madison's daring escape from the burning White House, to a pirate earning a presidential pardon, to the Star-Spangled Banner written on a British ship, to the most famous battle of the war being fought 2 weeks after peace was declared. The War of 1812 remains one of history's most gloriously bizarre conflicts. 3 countries remember it completely differently, and somehow, impossibly, all 3 think they won. Thanks for watching.